October 14th, 1943. 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The pencil scratched across worn leather as Feldwebel Heinrich Bartels of 5JG3 recorded what seemed like another routine entry in his logbook. His 17th heavy bomber destroyed. A B-17 Flying Fortress that had just spiraled earthward, trailing black smoke and desperate prayers. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf FW-190A6, he watched the remaining fortresses struggle to maintain their combat box formation. Their gunners spraying frantic streams of 50 caliber rounds into empty sky where German fighters had been moments before.
Stay tight.
The mathematics of aerial combat on this October afternoon were simple and brutal. German fighters could pick their moment of attack, strike from the sun with concentrated firepower, and escape before American bomber gunners could effectively respond.
If you found this story valuable, a like helps us share more forgotten chapters of history with those who appreciate them. Subscribe if you'd like to see more. Each story we uncover matters, and your support makes it possible to keep these voices from the past alive.
Without fighter escorts, and there were none above Schweinfurt, the American heavy bombers were nothing more than expensive flying targets, each carrying 10 young men who understood their odds with terrible clarity. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses had crossed into German airspace that morning, their mission to destroy the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, facilities that produced components essential to every piece of German military equipment, from tank turrets to aircraft instruments. Ball bearings were the hidden architecture of mechanized warfare, and Allied planners believed their destruction would cripple German war production within months. By sunset, 60 of those fortresses would never return to their bases in England. Another 17 would land so badly damaged, fuselages riddled with 20mm cannon holes, hydraulic systems destroyed, engines shot out, that they would be immediately written off, their battered airframes stripped for salvage parts. The 8th Air Force had lost 77 heavy bombers in a single day's operations. Over 600 airmen were dead, wounded, or beginning their journey to German prisoner-of-war camps. The Luftwaffe called it a turkey shoot. The Americans called it Black Thursday, the darkest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. What neither side fully grasped was that this moment of German triumph, this demonstration of defensive mastery over the heart of the Reich, would prove to be among the Luftwaffe's last. Within 4 months, everything would change. The confident German fighter pilots celebrating their victories in mess halls from Jever to Munich were drinking to an era that had already begun its collapse. The German fighter pilots of late 1943 had every tactical reason for their confidence. Men like Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, older brother of the famous Adolf Galland, Hauptmann Georg Peter Eder, and Major Walter Dahl had turned the interception of American bomber formations into a precise science of destruction. Through months of combat experience against the 8th Air Force's growing daylight offensive, they had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit every weakness in the bomber formation's defensive architecture. The standard American combat box formation positioned 18 to 21 B-17s in a three-dimensional defensive pattern designed on the theory that massed defensive firepower could ward off fighter attacks. Each flying fortress bristled with 13 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, twin guns in the chin, dorsal, ball, and tail turrets, plus single guns at waist positions and in the radio compartment. A full combat box could theoretically bring over 200 heavy machine guns to bear against attacking fighters. In theory, the interlocking fields of fire created a defensive sphere that no fighter could penetrate without destruction. In practice, German pilots had identified critical weaknesses that theory had overlooked. Blind spots existed in the nose before chin turret installations became standard. Ammunition supplies, while substantial, could be exhausted during prolonged attacks. Gunners firing at crossing targets struggled with deflection shooting. And most importantly, the psychological impact of sustained attacks, wave after wave of fighters pressing through the formation, degraded defensive effectiveness far more rapidly than ammunition expenditure alone. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commanding 5 JG-11, had perfected the head-on attack that exploited the B-17's most significant weakness, its initially limited forward defensive armament. On February 26, 1943, Knoke had shot down his first heavy bomber, a B-24 Liberator named Maisie, and by October 1943 had destroyed 16 more. His technique was lethally precise. Approach from 12 o'clock high, using the sun for concealment when possible. Dive through the formation at over 400 miles per hour, closing distance so rapidly that gunners had mere seconds to track and fire. Deliver a 2-second burst concentrated on the cockpit and engines, where damage would prove immediately catastrophic. Then break away in a diving turn before the top turret gunners could effectively respond. The statistics supported German confidence with the cold authority of mathematics. During the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, the Luftwaffe had shot down 60 bombers, 16% of the attacking force, in a single coordinated defensive operation. American losses were so severe that deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended for weeks, while commanders desperately sought solutions to a problem that seemed to have none. When the raids resumed with the second Schweinfurt attack on October 14th, the results proved even more devastating. 77 bombers lost or written off. Over 600 airmen killed or captured in a single afternoon. The loss rate had climbed to 26% of the attacking force, mathematically unsustainable for any air campaign. Major Walter Dahl, Gruppenkommandeur of Zupina, JG-3, developed the company front attack that multiplied German tactical advantages exponentially. 8 FW-190s would approach the bomber formation line abreast, saturating the defensive fire with multiple simultaneous targets approaching at a combined closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. American gunners, faced with 8 fighters in their gun sights simultaneously, had fractions of seconds to choose targets. Many shot at nothing in their panic, their tracers arcing harmlessly between the attacking aircraft. Those who did engage often selected the same target, leaving 7 other fighters to press their attacks unmolested. The psychological impact on bomber crews was devastating in ways that loss statistics alone could not capture. B-17 pilots who survived multiple missions over Germany developed what flight surgeons termed operational fatigue, a clinical euphemism for the psychological disintegration that resulted from repeatedly flying into what they understood to be calculated slaughter. Waist gunners stood at open windows in temperatures approaching -50 degrees Fahrenheit, watching comrades in adjacent aircraft explode into flames while knowing their turn might come on the next attack pass. The root of American vulnerability lay in simple physics that no amount of courage or tactical innovation could overcome. No Allied fighter aircraft in 1943 possessed the range to escort bombers deep into German territory. The Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, the primary American escort fighter in the European theater of operations, had a combat radius of approximately 375 miles with external drop tanks, sufficient to reach the German border, but no farther. The aircraft could escort bombers across France and into Belgium, but the Ruhr Valley marked the edge of its protective umbrella. Beyond that line, American bombers flew alone. The twin-engine Lockheed P-38J Lightning could fly farther than the Thunderbolt, its twin Allison V-1710 engines and internal fuel capacity providing extended range that single-engine fighters couldn't match. But the Lightning suffered mechanical failures at high altitude in the European cold that American engineers struggled to resolve. Engines failed when moisture in the intercooler system froze. Control cables became sluggish as lubricants thickened. The supercharger regulators that permitted high-altitude operation proved maddeningly unreliable. By late 1943, the P-38 had earned an unfortunate reputation among its pilots as an aircraft that might fail you precisely when you needed it most. This range limitation meant that American bombers flew the most dangerous portions of their missions, the final approach to targets deep in the Reich, the bomb run itself, and the initial withdrawal, completely alone. German fighters, operating from bases scattered across the Reich with intimate knowledge of their own airspace, simply waited beyond the range where Allied escorts were forced to turn back. Then they attacked with concentrated force against formations whose only defense was their own guns. Luftwaffe pilots called the point where Allied fighters turned back the golden moment, der goldene Augenblick. The phrase captured both the tactical opportunity and the psychological relief German pilots experienced when American escort fighters waggled their wings in farewell and banked westward toward England. From that moment until the bombers crossed back into escort range on their return journey, the Luftwaffe owned the sky. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, who would claim 206 aerial victories before his death in October 1943, described the tactic in recorded accounts that captured its methodical precision. We tracked the bomber streams on radar, calculating exactly where their escorts would turn back. Ground controllers vectored us to holding positions just beyond escort range. We watched the radar plots, waiting. The moment the little friends departed, we pounced. The bombers knew what was coming. You could see them tighten their formations in anticipation. The escort limitation created a deadly arithmetic that compounded with every mile flown into Germany. A B-17 formation penetrating to Schweinfurt faced 4 hours of flight over enemy territory, but only 90 minutes of that time. The initial penetration across France and the final withdrawal occurred under fighter protection. For over 2 hours in each direction, the bombers fought alone against an enemy who could choose when, where, and how to attack. German fighters exploited this advantage with mathematical efficiency. A Bf-109G6 pilot could engage a bomber formation, expend his ammunition, land at a forward airfield, refuel and rearm in 30 minutes, and take off again to attack the same formation as it withdrew. Some Luftwaffe pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties against a single American raid, each attack adding to the cumulative attrition that threatened to destroy the 8th Air Force as an effective combat force. The Luftwaffe had refined its defensive system into a coordinated killing machine. Ground radar stations, Freya for long-range detection, Würzburg for precise tracking, identified American bomber formations while they were still assembling over England. Ground controllers calculated likely targets based on formation heading and weather conditions. Fighter units received scramble orders timed to position them precisely where escorts would depart and bombers would become vulnerable. The system operated with Teutonic precision, each element optimized to exploit the single critical weakness in American air doctrine, the inability to protect bombers throughout their missions. By October 1943, German defensive confidence had reached its apex. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, despite his many failures, could point to Schweinfurt as evidence that the Luftwaffe remained master of German skies. The American daylight bombing campaign, which had seemed so threatening in the summer of 1943, appeared to be destroying itself through unsustainable losses. German aircraft production continued largely unmolested. The Reich's industrial heartland remained beyond effective American reach. Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 eventual victories, captured the prevailing confidence in conversations recorded by his adjutant. The Americans have made a fundamental strategic error. They insist on daylight precision bombing, but they cannot protect their bombers in daylight. Their losses are unsustainable. Either they will abandon daylight operations entirely, as the British have done, or they will exhaust their bomber force attempting the impossible. The logic seemed irrefutable. American losses at Schweinfurt translated to an annualized attrition rate that would destroy the 8th Air Force's bomber strength faster than American factories could replace it. The mathematics of industrial warfare, which German planners believed they understood, suggested that time favored the defender. Every American bomber shot down represented not just 10 trained aircrew lost, but months of factory production destroyed. Every German fighter lost could be replaced more quickly, its pilot often surviving to fly again. What German analysts failed to calculate was the American response to their tactical dominance. In conference rooms at Wright Field, in engineering offices at North American Aviation, in test facilities where mechanics worked through nights under harsh electric lights, American engineers were already solving the unsolvable problem. They were creating an aircraft that would transform the fundamental mathematics of aerial warfare. A fighter that could fly from England to Berlin and back, engage German interceptors over the Reich capital, and return to base with fuel to spare. The confident German fighter pilots drinking to their October victories didn't know it yet, but they were celebrating the final months of an era. The killing machine they had perfected against unescorted bombers was about to become obsolete. The golden moment was about to end forever. Within 4 months, American fighters would appear over Berlin itself, a development German planners had calculated as physically impossible for single-engine aircraft. Within 6 months, the Luftwaffe would be hemorrhaging pilots at rates that made American October losses seem modest by comparison. Within a year, German fighter pilots would refuse missions against American formations, not from cowardice, but from the mathematical certainty that attacking escorted bombers had become suicide. The transformation would be so rapid, so complete, that German officers interrogated after the war would struggle to explain how total dominance had collapsed into total defeat. They would speak of a single aircraft type, a fighter they had initially dismissed as just another American design, that had changed everything. They would describe the moment they first saw those distinctive squared-off wingtips and inline engine profiles deep over Germany, where no American fighter was supposed to be able to reach. But on the evening of October 14, 1943, those revelations lay in the future. In the gathering darkness over Schweinfurt, German pilots counted their victories while American survivors limped homeward in shattered formations, their numbers so reduced that some groups could barely maintain defensive integrity. The mathematics of attrition seemed clear. The Luftwaffe had won. They had won the battle. They were about to lose the war. April 1940, New York City. The British Purchasing Commission occupied a suite of offices on Wall Street, their mission urgent and their timeline impossible. France was falling. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated over Poland and Norway that air superiority determined the fate of nations. Britain stood nearly alone, her aircraft factories producing Spitfires and Hurricanes at rates that couldn't match projected losses in the air battles everyone knew were coming. The Commission needed fighters. Hundreds of them, thousands if possible. And American factories represented the only source capable of delivering them before the Wehrmacht crossed the English Channel. Sir Henry Self, leading the Commission's aircraft procurement efforts, approached Curtiss Wright with a straightforward request: license production of additional P-40 Warhawk fighters for the Royal Air Force. The P-40 was not an exceptional aircraft. Its Allison V-1710 engine lost power above 15,000 feet, making it unsuitable for the high-altitude combat that characterized European air warfare. But it was available, it was proven, and Britain was in no position to be selective. The request seemed routine, a simple matter of expanding existing production lines to meet desperate need. What happened next would alter the trajectory of the air war, though no one recognized it at the time. Curtiss Wright's production capacity was already stretched beyond reasonable limits. They couldn't accommodate British orders without disrupting deliveries to the United States Army Air Corps. Self, facing rejection, turned to an alternative supplier. North American Aviation, a company that had never produced a fighter aircraft for any customer. James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, listened to Self's proposal with the calculating attention of an engineer who understood both aircraft design and industrial production. Self wanted North American to manufacture P-40s under license. A straightforward arrangement that would put fighters in RAF hands within months. Kindleberger's counter-proposal was audacious to the point of apparent recklessness. North American would design and build an entirely new fighter aircraft, superior to the P-40, and deliver the first prototype within 120 days. The claim seemed preposterous. Aircraft development typically required years of design work, wind tunnel testing, prototype construction, and iterative refinement. The P-40 itself had evolved through multiple variants over half a decade. Kindleberger was proposing to compress this process into 4 months, a timeline that violated every principle of careful engineering development. But Kindleberger had assets that made the impossible merely difficult. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmuid, was a German-born aeronautical engineer who had worked at Fokker in the Netherlands and Messerschmitt in Bavaria before emigrating to America. Schmuid understood European fighter design philosophy intimately. More importantly, he had been working on advanced fighter concepts for months, waiting for an opportunity to translate theoretical designs into production aircraft. He had drawings. He had calculations. He had solutions to problems that other designers hadn't yet recognized as problems. The aircraft that emerged from this desperate timeline would be designated NA-73, later to become the P-51 Mustang. Its design incorporated innovations that would prove revolutionary, though their full implications wouldn't become apparent for years. Schmuid's laminar flow wing, a design that maintained smooth airflow across a greater percentage of the wing surface than conventional airfoils, reduced drag by nearly 30% compared to contemporary fighters. This single innovation translated directly into fuel efficiency and range, though the design team initially valued it primarily for speed. The NA-73X prototype rolled out of North American's Inglewood, California facility on September 9, 1940, 102 days after the contract was signed, beating Kindleberger's promised deadline by 18 days. The aircraft that emerged was sleek, modern, and visually distinctive, its inline Allison V17-1039 engine giving it a slim nose profile that contrasted sharply with the bulbous radial engine fighters then dominating American production. First flight came on October 26, 1940, with test pilot Vance Breese at the controls. The flight test results confirmed Schmuid's calculations. The NA-73X was fast, 382 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, faster than any American fighter then in production. Its handling characteristics were exceptional, responsive without being twitchy, stable without being sluggish. Range with internal fuel exceeded 750 miles, far beyond contemporary single-engine fighters. On paper and in the air, the aircraft represented a significant advancement in fighter design. But the Allison engine that gave the aircraft its distinctive profile also imposed a critical limitation. The V17-1039 was a single-stage, single-speed supercharged engine optimized for low and medium altitude performance. Below 15,000 feet, it produced competitive power, 150 horsepower at 11,800 feet. Above that altitude, performance degraded rapidly as the supercharger couldn't maintain sea-level manifold pressure in the thinner air. At 25,000 feet, where European air combat increasingly occurred, the Allison-powered Mustang was significantly slower than both the Bf-109 and Spitfire. The Royal Air Force, receiving their first Mustang in late 1941, immediately recognized both the aircraft's potential and its limitations. The Mustang was superb at low altitude, faster than the Spitfire below 15,000 feet, with range that made it invaluable for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions over occupied France. RAF Army Cooperation Command employed Mustangs for rhubarb operations, low-level strafing attacks against targets of opportunity in France and the Low Countries. In this role, the aircraft excelled, its range permitting deep penetration that Spitfires couldn't match. But the Mustang couldn't fight where the critical air battles were being decided. Bomber Escort, the mission that would prove decisive in the air war over Europe, required sustained performance above 20,000 feet. The Allison-powered Mustang, for all its low-altitude excellence, was unsuitable for the mission that mattered most. The transformation that would change everything began with a single test flight in April 1942. Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot assigned to evaluate RAF aircraft, flew an Allison-powered Mustang running from the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. The experience was revelatory. Harker immediately recognized that the Mustang's airframe, its aerodynamic efficiency, its structural integrity, its design sophistication, was superior to any British single-engine fighter then in service. What the aircraft needed was an engine that could match its airframe. Harker's report to Rolls-Royce management was emphatic and specific. The Mustang airframe, he argued, should be mated with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that had transformed the Spitfire 9 into an aircraft capable of matching the Focke-Wulf FW-190 at high altitude. The Merlin 61 produced 1,565 horsepower at 12,250 feet and maintained that power to nearly 24,000 feet through its sophisticated supercharger system. If the Mustang's exceptional airframe could be combined with the Merlin's high-altitude performance, the result might be extraordinary. The conversion project proceeded with wartime urgency on both sides of the Atlantic. Rolls-Royce began modifications in Britain, fitting Merlin 61 engines to Mustang airframes provided by the RAF. Simultaneously, North American Aviation worked with Packard, which was manufacturing Merlins under license in Detroit, to develop an American version of the conversion. The Packard F-1653 was essentially a Merlin 61 built in American factories with American manufacturing techniques, a marriage of British engineering and American industrial capacity that would characterize the entire Mustang program. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942, and the results exceeded even Harker's optimistic projections. Maximum speed increased from 390 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour, a 51-mile-per-hour improvement from an engine change alone. More critically, performance above 20,000 feet was transformed. Where the Allison-powered Mustang had struggled at high altitude, the Merlin-powered variant was exceptional. Service ceiling jumped from 31,350 feet to 41,900 feet. The aircraft that had been a superb low-altitude fighter had become a superb fighter at any altitude. But speed and altitude performance, while essential, were not what made the P-51B revolutionary. What made it revolutionary was range, and range resulted from the confluence of factors that no single designer had fully anticipated. The laminar flow wing that Schmood had designed for aerodynamic efficiency also provided exceptional fuel efficiency. The P-51B's drag coefficient was substantially lower than any contemporary fighter. Where a P-47D Thunderbolt consumed approximately 100 gallons of fuel per hour in cruise flight, the P-51B burned only 65 gallons at the same speed. This efficiency advantage compounded with every mile flown. The P-51B's internal fuel capacity was 184 gallons, substantially less than the P-47's 305 gallons, but the lighter, more efficient airframe extracted more miles from each gallon. With internal fuel alone, the P-51B had a combat radius exceeding 400 miles, already superior to the Thunderbolt. But the aircraft's designers had incorporated hard points capable of carrying external drop tanks, and this capability would prove decisive. When 75-gallon drop tanks were fitted to the P-51B in early 1944, combat radius extended to 650 miles, sufficient to escort bombers to targets deep in Germany that had previously been beyond fighter protection. When 108-gallon tanks became available in March 1944, combat radius stretched to 850 miles. With these larger tanks, P-51Bs could escort bombers to Berlin, engage German fighters in sustained combat over the Reich capital, and return to bases in England with fuel reserves for emergencies. No other single-engine fighter in the world could approach this combination of range and performance. The P-47D, even with maximum external fuel, couldn't reach Berlin. The P-38J could reach far into Germany, but suffered mechanical problems and couldn't match the P-51B's air combat performance against German single-engine fighters. The Spitfire, Britain's finest interceptor, had a combat radius barely exceeding 175 miles, exceptional for home defense, inadequate for offensive operations over Germany. The 354th Fighter Group received the first P-51Bs in November 1943, their aircraft arriving at Boxted Airfield in Essex, still bearing factory paint and smelling of new rubber and hydraulic fluid. The group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group in recognition of their role introducing the aircraft to combat, was technically assigned to the 9th Air Force, but the desperate need for long-range escort fighters meant they were immediately attached to 8th Air Force operations. Colonel Kenneth Martin, commanding the 354th, faced the challenge of converting his pilots from the P-47 Thunderbolt to an entirely different aircraft in a matter of days. The Thunderbolt and Mustang were as different as aircraft sharing the same general mission could be. The P-47 was massive, over 7 tons fully loaded, with a radial engine, a wide fuselage, and flight characteristics that pilots described as driving a truck. The P-51B was sleek, light, responsive, its inline engine providing a slim profile and visibility that Thunderbolt pilots had never experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who would later command the 353rd Fighter Group, flew one of the first P-51B orientation flights and left a recorded account that captured the pilots' immediate recognition of what they had received. The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something special. The Mustang handled like a sports car compared to the truck-like Thunderbolt. It was responsive, fast, and most importantly, it could fly forever. We had been handed the weapon we needed. The first P-51B combat mission came on December 1, 1943, a fighter sweep over Belgium and France designed to test the aircraft's combat characteristics against anticipated German opposition. The sweep encountered no enemy aircraft, but confirmed the Mustang's handling qualities in operational conditions. Pilots reported exceptional visibility, responsive controls, and, most importantly, fuel consumption rates that promised the extended range they had been told to expect. December 5th brought the first Escort mission, a relatively short-range operation to Amiens that kept the new aircraft within comfortable fuel margins while pilots accumulated experience. 16 P-51Bs accompanied the bomber formation, more as a combat evaluation than a full escort commitment. They encountered no German fighters, but the mission proved the aircraft's basic suitability for the escort role. The mission that announced the Mustang's arrival to the Luftwaffe came on December 13, 1943. For the first time, P-51Bs escorted heavy bombers to Kiel, 490 miles from base, a penetration depth that had been impossible for Allied single-engine fighters just weeks before. German controllers, tracking the incoming raid on their Freya radar stations, vectored interceptors to the standard assembly points beyond expected escort range. They anticipated the familiar pattern. American fighters turning back at the German border, bombers continuing alone into the golden moment. The fighters didn't turn back. German pilots rising to intercept what they expected to be unescorted bombers found themselves engaging American single-engine fighters over northern Germany, aircraft they didn't immediately recognize, flying at altitudes and distances that their intelligence briefings had told them were impossible. Initial confusion gave way to alarm as the implications became clear. The Americans had solved the range problem. The sanctuary of German airspace beyond escort range no longer existed. Radio intercepts captured by Allied intelligence revealed the German reaction. Controllers repeatedly queried pilots about fighter types and positions, unable to believe that single-engine American escorts had penetrated so far into the Reich. Confirm aircraft type. The question echoed across Luftwaffe frequencies as ground controllers struggled to update tactical pictures that no longer matched assumptions built over months of successful defensive operations. Major Klaus Meithusch, commanding 7 JG-26, landed from a December engagement in which Mustangs had pursued his fighters nearly to their home airfield, something that had never happened before in the air war over Germany. His assessment, recorded by unit intelligence officers, captured the strategic implications that experienced Luftwaffe pilots immediately recognized. The air war has fundamentally changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists. They will come deeper, and we cannot stop them by waiting for them to exhaust their fuel. Through the final weeks of 1943, the 354th Fighter Group accumulated experience and victories, while the Luftwaffe attempted to adjust to a tactical environment that had shifted beneath them. On December 20th, P-51Bs escorted bombers to Bremen, claiming 3 German fighters destroyed without loss. The exchange ratios that had favored German defenders against unescorted bombers began to shift as Mustang pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's advantages. The P-51B pilots discovered that their aircraft could compete with anything the Luftwaffe flew. Against the Bf-109G, the Mustang held advantages in speed, range, and dive performance, with roughly comparable maneuverability. Against the FW-190A, the Mustang was faster at altitude, could outdive and outclimb its opponent, and could sustain combat long after German fighters had exhausted their fuel and ammunition. American pilots, who had spent months watching bombers die beyond their reach, now had an aircraft that could take the fight to the Luftwaffe over Germany itself. But December 1943 was merely a preview. The 354th Fighter Group operated alone with fewer than 50 aircraft, insufficient to provide comprehensive escort for major raids. The Luftwaffe, while alarmed, still possessed numerical superiority in fighters and the advantage of fighting over home territory. The fundamental transformation of the air war required not just a superior aircraft, but that aircraft in sufficient numbers to overwhelm German defensive capacity. That transformation was coming. North American Aviation's Inglewood and Dallas plants were producing P-51Bs at accelerating rates. Additional fighter groups were converting from P-47s and P-38s to the new Mustang. The 8th Air Force, which had suspended deep penetration raids after the October Schweinfurt disaster, was preparing to resume strategic bombing with escort protection that would extend to any target in Germany. The German High Command, reviewing intelligence assessments of American fighter production and deployment, began to recognize the magnitude of the threat. The P-51B was not merely another American fighter type to be cataloged and countered through tactical adjustment. It was a strategic weapon system that threatened to invalidate the entire German defensive architecture. Every assumption about Reich air defense, the calculations of escort range, the positioning of fighter units, the exploitation of geographical advantage, required revision. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, commanding German fighter forces, requested immediate briefings on the new American aircraft. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk in late December 1943 made clear that the Luftwaffe faced not a tactical problem, but a strategic crisis. The Americans had found a way to protect their bombers throughout their missions. The golden moment was ending. The killing machine that German pilots had perfected against unescorted bombers was about to become obsolete. In the cold winter of early 1944, American pilots in their new Mustangs looked east toward targets that had been beyond reach for 2 years of air warfare. German pilots in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs looked west toward an enemy that no longer had to fight on German terms. The mathematics of aerial combat was changing, and both sides knew it. The question that remained was whether the Luftwaffe could adapt before the Mustangs arrived in numbers sufficient to destroy it. March 4, 1944, 25,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. Colonel Donald Blakesley pressed his face against the gun sight of his P-51B, scanning the scattered clouds below for the distinctive outline that every American fighter pilot had memorized from recognition charts. Through the breaks in the undercast, the sprawling grid of Berlin was unmistakably visible. the Spree River threading through the urban mass, the Tiergarten's winter-brown rectangle, the rail yards and factory complexes that spread across the Reich capital like a gray industrial stain. For 2 years of air warfare, this city had represented the impossible destination, the target that American bombers could reach but never survive, the heart of Nazi Germany that Hermann Göring had sworn would never see enemy aircraft. Above it now, in formations that stretched across 15 miles of sky, flew 660 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators carrying over 1,600 tons of high explosives intended for the Erkner ball-bearing works and the Bosch electrical equipment factory. Surrounding them, weaving protective patterns that contracted and expanded with the rhythm of tactical necessity, were scores of single-engine fighters bearing the white star of the United States Army Air Forces. The 4th Fighter Group had led its 3 squadrons of P-51Bs on the 1,100-mile round trip from Debden, England, arriving over Berlin with fuel sufficient for 20 minutes of combat and the return flight home. The first American fighter escort to Berlin represented more than a tactical achievement to be recorded in mission reports and intelligence summaries. It was a psychological demolition of German invincibility, a visible proof that the strategic assumptions underlying Reich air defense had collapsed overnight. For Luftwaffe pilots rising from airfields around Berlin to intercept the incoming raid, the sight of American single-engine fighters over their capital was incomprehensible. They had been told, briefed repeatedly by intelligence officers citing the limitations of American aircraft, that Allied fighters could never reach Berlin. The distance was too great. The fuel requirements exceeded the capacity of any single-engine aircraft. It was physically impossible. Yet there they were, fresh and aggressive after flying 550 miles from England, while German defenders were the ones running low on fuel after just taking off from bases practically beneath the American formation. The fundamental mathematics of aerial combat had inverted in ways that German tactical doctrine couldn't accommodate. The combat that followed was savage in its intensity and decisive in its implications. The Luftwaffe committed over 200 fighters to defend Berlin, Bf-1019G6s from JG-3 and JG-27, FW-190A8s from JG-1 and JG-11, twin-engine Bf-110G2s from ZG-26 that had been optimized for attacking unescorted bombers. German controllers, still struggling to believe their radar plots, vectored these interceptors toward the bomber stream with tactical plans developed over months of successful defensive operations. The pilots who climbed to attack altitude expected the familiar pattern: bombers alone, their defensive gunfire the only obstacle between German fighters and easy victories. Instead, they found Mustangs waiting with altitude advantage and aggressive pilots who had spent months watching bombers die beyond their reach. The 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 15 German fighters destroyed in the swirling combat over Brandenburg. More significantly, attack after attack on the bomber formation was broken up before it could develop. Mustangs slashing through German formations and scattering interceptors before they could concentrate their firepower against the heavy bombers. Captain Don Gentile of the 336th Fighter Squadron, who would finish the war as one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces, engaged a staffel of Bf-109s attempting to form up for a company front attack on a B-17 combat box. His combat report captured the transformed dynamics of aerial warfare over Germany. They were setting up for a head-on pass on the bombers, 8 of them in line abreast. We came down from 28,000 with the sun behind us. I got the leader, and my wingman got number 2 before they even knew we were there. The rest scattered. They never made their attack. For German pilots who survived the March 4th engagement, the experience produced a cognitive dissonance that intelligence officers struggled to document. Everything they had been taught about American capabilities, about the limitations of enemy fighters, about the safety of German airspace deep in the Reich, had been proven false in a single afternoon. Lieutenant Heinz Sachsenberg of the Sektion JG-3, who would survive the war with 25 victories, described the shock in terms that captured its strategic implications. We had been told the American fighters couldn't reach Berlin. When I saw them over the city, I knew immediately that everything had changed. If they could come this far, they could come anywhere. There was no sanctuary left. The psychological impact radiated outward from the pilots who had fought over Berlin to encompass the entire Luftwaffe command structure. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, confronted with reports that American fighters had appeared over the capital he had promised to protect, initially refused to believe the intelligence. When gun camera footage from German fighters clearly showed P-51s in combat over Berlin, Göring reportedly responded with words that have become legendary in aviation history, though their exact phrasing varies across sources. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. Whether those precise words were spoken, the sentiment they capture was universal among German leadership who understood air warfare. The entire defensive architecture of the Reich, the positioning of fighter units, the radar warning network, the tactical doctrine developed over 2 years of successful interception, had been designed around a single assumption: that American escorts would be forced to turn back at a calculable distance from their bases, leaving bombers vulnerable for hours over German territory. That assumption had been destroyed in a single day's operations. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, commanding German fighter forces, understood the strategic catastrophe more clearly than most. In post-war accounts and memoirs, he consistently identified the arrival of long-range escort fighters as the turning point in the air war, not because of any single battle, but because of what it meant for every battle that would follow. The Mustang didn't just extend the bomber offensive, it transformed it. We could no longer choose when and where to fight. They brought the battle to us on their terms, whenever they wished, wherever they wished. The implications cascaded through German defensive planning with devastating speed. Training fields, assembly areas, and aircraft factories had been deliberately located in central and eastern Germany, positioned in regions that planners believed were safe from fighter attack. The Messerschmitt works at Regensburg, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the synthetic fuel facilities at Luna, all had been sited beyond what German intelligence calculated as maximum American escort range. Now American fighters could strafe airfields near Prague, engage German interceptors over Munich, and escort bombers to any target within the Reich's borders. The geographical sanctuary that had permitted German industry to continue production despite 2 years of bombing had vanished. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force since January 1944, recognized the strategic opportunity that long-range escorts had created. His orders to fighter commanders, issued in the weeks before the Berlin mission, reversed decades of escort doctrine. Rather than staying close to bomber formations in purely defensive patterns, American fighters were to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. Escort protection remained the primary mission, but once bombers had reached their targets and begun their homeward journey, fighters were freed to attack German aircraft on the ground, over their airfields, during takeoff and landing, anywhere German planes could be found. The shift from defensive escort to offensive counter-air operations transformed the mathematics of attrition in ways that compounded with every mission. German fighters that rose to intercept bomber formations now faced not just combat over the target area, but pursuit all the way back to their airfields. Mustang pilots learned to follow damaged German fighters down, waiting until fuel-starved interceptors committed to landing approaches before attacking. Aircraft that might have survived damaged in the pre-Mustang era were now destroyed during recovery, their pilots killed in moments when they believed themselves safe. The statistics that emerged from this transformed air war told a story of catastrophic attrition that German training programs could not match. In January 1944, before Mustangs reached operational strength, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots killed, wounded, or captured. In February, as Mustang numbers increased, losses climbed to 2,121. March brought 2,115 pilot casualties. These numbers represented not just attrition, but the systematic destruction of experience. The pilots being killed were not replaceable raw recruits, but veterans with years of combat knowledge. Men like Hauptmann Anton Hackel, Major Wilhelm Lemke, Oberleutnant Hugo Frey, and hundreds of others whose tactical expertise had been accumulated over hundreds of missions. American losses during the same period, while significant in absolute numbers, represented a sustainable exchange rate. The vast American training establishment, flight schools across Texas, Arizona, and California, producing 11,000 new pilots monthly, could replace losses faster than they occurred. German training programs, already constrained by fuel shortages and the demands of operational units, fell further behind with each passing month. The operation that demonstrated the new strategic reality most clearly was Big Week, the coordinated assault on German aircraft production launched February 20-25, 1944. For 6 consecutive days, weather permitting, the 8th Air Force dispatched maximum effort missions against factories producing airframes, engines, and components essential to Luftwaffe strength. P-51Bs provided escort throughout, engaging German interceptors over targets that had been effectively immune to sustained attack just months before. The scale of operations exceeded anything previously attempted in the air war. The 8th Air Force flew 3,300 bomber sorties during Big Week, dropping over 10,000 tons of bombs on aircraft production facilities from Regensburg to Brunswick. Fighter escorts flew 3,673 sorties, engaging German interceptors in running battles across the Reich. American losses were significant. 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters failed to return, but German losses were catastrophic. Over 500 Luftwaffe fighters were destroyed in combat, with pilot casualties approaching 400. More damaging than the immediate losses was the strategic impact on German aircraft production. The concentrated attacks disrupted production schedules, damaged specialized machine tools, and forced the dispersal of manufacturing facilities into smaller, less efficient plants scattered across Germany. While German industry demonstrated remarkable resilience, production actually increased later in 1944 through heroic dispersal efforts. The attacks delayed new aircraft programs and consumed resources that might otherwise have accelerated jet fighter development. The Luftwaffe attempted various tactical responses to the transformed threat environment, each proving inadequate against the combination of American numbers, range, and performance. Sturmgruppen, specialized heavy assault units equipped with heavily armed and armored FWW-190A8s, designed to break through fighter screens and destroy bombers at close range, achieved occasional successes but suffered devastating losses when Mustangs caught them during their ponderous attack approaches. The heavily loaded Sturmbach fighters, optimized for destroying bombers, couldn't maneuver effectively against nimble Mustang attacks. German commanders tried mass attacks with entire Gruppen engaging simultaneously, hoping to saturate American fighter defenses through sheer numbers. But the 8th Air Force had its own numbers advantage, deploying hundreds of escorts that could absorb German attacks while maintaining protective screens around bomber formations. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with greater production capacity and training throughput, and that side was unambiguously American. The systematic campaign against German oil production, enabled by long-range escort capability, delivered the coup de grace to Luftwaffe operational effectiveness. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Pöhlitz, Brooks, and other sites, facilities that had operated with relative impunity beyond escort range, now faced regular precision attacks with full fighter protection. The impact on German fuel availability was catastrophic and cascading. Aviation fuel production collapsed from 175,000 tons in April 1944 to 30,000 tons in July, an 83% reduction in 3 months. By September, production had fallen to 10,000 tons, barely sufficient to maintain basic operational capability. Training flights were curtailed, then eliminated entirely as every available gallon was reserved for combat operations. New pilots arrived at operational units with as few as 50 hours total flight time, barely competent to take off and land, let alone engage experienced American fighter pilots in aerial combat. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-7 with its revolutionary Me-262 jet fighters, captured the bitter irony of German technological achievement undermined by logistics failure. We had the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour, able to outrun any Allied aircraft. But we could barely fuel them for combat missions. I watched dozens of these superb aircraft sit idle on dispersal fields, while Mustangs roamed freely overhead, looking for targets. We had produced the future of air combat, but couldn't fly it. June 6, 1944, D-Day, demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority that had occurred in 6 months. During the invasion of Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over France, compared to 14,674 Allied sorties. Only 2 German fighters appeared over the invasion beaches. The greatest amphibious operation in history proceeded under an aerial umbrella so dominant that German air opposition was effectively non-existent. Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, flew one of those 2 sorties with his wingman Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk. Making a single strafing run along Sword Beach, the only ground attack mounted by the Luftwaffe on D-Day, Priller later described the mission as suicide disguised as duty. They survived only because Allied fighters were too surprised by their appearance to react before they had fled inland. 2 aircraft against an invasion force of 5,000 ships and 13,000 aircraft. The disparity measured the magnitude of German air impotence. The human cost of this transformation was devastating on both sides, but asymmetrically so. American losses, while significant, represented sustainable attrition within a military system designed for mass mobilization. German losses destroyed an irreplaceable generation of combat pilots whose experience could not be transferred to replacement personnel, regardless of how quickly aircraft could be produced. Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group, who finished the war with 15.5 aerial victories, described a March 1944 engagement that captured the brutal finality of aerial combat. "I got a 109 at about 18,000 feet. He rolled over and went straight down. I followed him, watching for the parachute. He never got out. I don't know if he was hit or if the canopy jammed. He went in with his aircraft." Such scenes multiplied thousands of times across the skies of Europe, each representing not just a lost aircraft, but a lost pilot whose training and experience had taken years to develop. German pilot Walter Schuck of JG-7, who survived the war with 206 victories including 8 heavy bombers, described the transformed nature of combat in terms that revealed the psychological collapse accompanying physical attrition. In 1943, we were knights of the air, jousting with bombers in something approaching fair combat. By 1944, we were being pursued relentlessly. Mustangs would follow us down to our airfields, circle overhead while we tried to land, then attack. There was no safety anywhere. Even our own bases had become killing grounds. The Luftwaffe's technological response, the Me-262 jet fighter, arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. The aircraft was revolutionary, capable of 540 miles per hour, and armed with 4 30mm Mk-108 cannon that could destroy a heavy bomber with a single well-placed burst. In the hands of experienced pilots like Adolf Galland, who commanded the elite JV-44 in the war's final months, the Me-262 achieved exchange ratios that vindicated its design. Galland personally shot down 7 aircraft while flying jets, demonstrating that technological superiority could still influence individual combats. But technology without fuel, without trained pilots, without industrial support, proved operationally irrelevant. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group, shot down two Me-262s on October 7, 1944, catching them in the landing pattern at their base when fuel exhaustion had forced them into predictable approach paths. The jets, throttled back and configured for landing, were helpless against diving Mustangs. The world's most advanced fighter aircraft destroyed by an aircraft designed 4 years earlier. The victory illustrated that systems triumph over components in industrial warfare. By early 1945, the arithmetic of air combat had become impossible for Germany. The 8th Air Force alone operated over 1,000 Mustangs organized into 14 fighter groups. Against this force, the Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 300 to 400 serviceable fighters on any given day, scattered across the entire Reich, flown by pilots whose average experience had declined to a fraction of their American opponents. The kill ratios reflected this imbalance with statistical brutality. By 1945, Mustang pilots were claiming 10 victories for every loss. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, ended the war with 24 aerial victories, all in Mustangs. His post-war observation captured the transformation from combat to execution. By 1945, it wasn't combat anymore. It was slaughter. We'd find German airfields, circle overhead, and shoot down anyone who tried to take off or land. The Mustang had made all of Germany a free fire zone. Captured German officers provided eloquent testimony to the Mustang's decisive impact. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top aces with 220 victories, assessed the aircraft with professional appreciation that transcended national loyalty. The Mustang was not just another fighter. It was a complete weapons system. Everything about it was optimized for its mission: range, performance, firepower, pilot comfort. We had excellent aircraft, but nothing that combined all elements so effectively. General der Flieger Paul Deichmann, who had commanded Luftwaffe forces in various theaters, provided strategic perspective in post-war interrogations. We made many mistakes in the air war, but our greatest error was underestimating American capacity for innovation under pressure. We believed our technical superiority was permanent. The Mustang proved it was temporary. You solved the range problem we thought unsolvable, and once you solved it, you destroyed us. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, American and German fighter pilots met at a reunion in San Antonio, Texas. The conversations between former enemies revealed the lasting psychological impact of the Mustang's appearance over Germany. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs and scored 16.25 aerial victories, sat across from Oberstleutnant Günther Rahl, Germany's third highest scoring ace with 275 victories. Rahl raised his glass in a toast that acknowledged what 4 decades of reflection had clarified. To the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war, we had excellent aircraft, superb pilots, and were fighting over our homeland. But you had the Mustang, and that made all the difference. Former General Lieutenant Johannes Steinhoff, his face still bearing scars from the Me-262 crash that had ended his combat career in April 1945, offered the reflection that perhaps best captured what the Mustang had meant to both sides. We laughed at your bombers in 1943 because we couldn't imagine that America could produce a fighter with the range to escort them to Berlin. The P-51 Mustang taught us the danger of underestimating our enemies. You ask when we knew the war was lost? It was that day in March 1944 when we looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin. At that moment, every German pilot knew the truth. We had already lost. The transformation from German laughter to German defeat had occurred with a speed that still astonishes military historians. In October 1943, the Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Germany, shooting down American bombers at rates that threatened to destroy the 8th Air Force as an effective combat organization. By March 1944, 5 months later, Mustangs were escorting bombers to Berlin. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was combat ineffective. By April 1945, it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The P-51 Mustang achieved this transformation not through any single battle or campaign, but through the systematic application of range, performance, and numbers against an enemy who couldn't match American industrial capacity. The aircraft that silenced German laughter was itself a product of the democratic innovation and international cooperation that Nazi ideology had taught Germans to despise. British engines in American airframes, built by assembly lines staffed by workers that German racial theory dismissed as inferior, had destroyed the Luftwaffe more completely than any previous air campaign in history. The German pilots who had laughed at unescorted bombers in October 1943 learned by March 1944 that they had laughed too soon. By May 1945, most were no longer alive to regret their premature confidence. The P-51 Mustang had written its name across the skies of Europe in burning German fighters and liberated territory, proving that in industrial warfare, victory belongs not to the bravest soldiers or most brilliant tacticians, but to the nation that can produce the most, train the best, and innovate the fastest. The laughter had become silence. The golden moment had ended forever, and over the shattered Reich, the Mustangs flew on, masters of skies that German pilots had once believed would be theirs forever.